Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this third part in our Back to Basics series on immigration matters. And today's session is on immigration compliance issues. So just to start with introductions, for those of you who don't know, I'm Elaine McElroy, one of the partners in the Employment and Immigration team at Brodie's, and with me today is Erin McLafferty, who will also be presenting part of the session. And in terms of the agenda for today, before I get into the detail on that, I guess it's worth just putting the session into a bit of context in terms of why compliance is important. And I think immigration compliance has never been more important. Since the end of the Brexit transition period, we've seen a huge increase in the numbers of employers obtaining a sponsor licence under the points-based immigration system, and we've also seen a huge increase in the number of people sponsored under the skilled worker route, partly because Europeans need to be sponsored in the same way as everyone else now, and also just due to the range of jobs which are now suitable for sponsorship. So having your licence and keeping it has never been more important. So today we're going to talk about a bit of an overview of what the compliance obligations are that go along with having a sponsored licence. We're going to touch on some of the reporting that needs to be done through the online sponsor management system about changes of circumstances for individual migrant workers. And then we're also going to talk about changes that need to be reported about your organisation, and sometimes these are the ones that are actually forgotten about. We often do come across clients that have forgotten to report certain things and perhaps have to do it later on. So being familiar with what does require to be reported within the particular timescales is important. We'll also talk a bit about record keeping, so that's one of the key areas that UKVI look at if they come out to do compliance check, to check that you've got the information on file that you're supposed to have for each migrant worker. And we'll also look at the sorts of things that UKVI consider if they come out to do a compliance visit. And they can do a compliance visit at any time, either before the licence is granted or at any time in the lifetime of the licence, or perhaps when you're due to renew your licence. So being prepared for one of those is really important, especially as most visits are unannounced rather than sort of planned in advance. So being ready at any point for one of those is important, and hopefully today's session will help with that. So starting then with an overview of why compliance is important. I guess I've set out there certain consequences if you don't get it right. So there's certain financial risks that go along with not having the compliance piece right, and that could be that you might have an action plan imposed on you, which would usually recommend areas that need to be improved within a set time frame. And even for the action plan itself, UKVI charge you £1,476. But probably more importantly, if you don't comply with the laws on illegal working, and that's one of the areas that UKVI expect you to have right if you hold a sponsor licence, that can result in financial penalties of up to £20,000 per illegal worker. So lots of financial consequences of getting it wrong. But probably more important actually is the operational risk to a business if they don't have their compliance obligations sorted, and if that results in some kind of action being taken against them by UKVI. If the compliance breaches are not too material, UKVI might, as I said, give you an action plan. They might downgrade your sponsor licence to a B rating. And if that happens, it means that the employer is not allowed to sponsor new migrants, subject to pretty limited exceptions. In the worst case, for really material breaches or a series of breaches, it's possible that the organisation might lose the licence altogether. In that case, obviously no one new can be sponsored, but also existing sponsored workers that you've got working for you can have their leave curtailed, and that might be shortened to a period of 60 days. if they haven't been complicit in the breach, and in the worst case where they have been involved in any compliance breaches, their leave may be curtailed immediately. And that could be a bit of a disaster for many businesses that rely on migrant workers, either to fulfill certain senior level roles or roles with specialist skill sets, or where a significant population of your staff are sponsored. But for many businesses, it would be a bit of a business disaster to lose the license altogether. In many cases, as well, as the license is revoked, there's actually a cooling off period that then falls into place, meaning that you can't just go off the next week and apply for a new sponsor license. Usually there's a period of time during which the employer can't get a new sponsor license, and that poor history of compliance is likely to be taken into account in any decision about whether to give the organisation a new license in the future. Finally, reputational risk, that's a third element of the risk on the slide there. I guess either compliance breaches in relation to your sponsor license or illegal working breaches can often result in articles in the press, etc. UKVI also name and shame employers that are guilty of employing illegal workers, etc. So that reputational piece can also be really important, and it can lead to headlines. You probably remember from years ago, Byron Burger being raided with illegal workers, etc. So those things do stay in people's heads and is an important risk to bear in mind. So the areas that UKVI look at in terms of compliance fall broadly into these sort of 5 categories. The first area that I've mentioned already is preventing illegal working. They want to know that the employer has suitable processes in place to comply with right to work checks. Those apply, I suppose, to employers whether or not they have a sponsor license. But for those employers that do have one, it becomes even more important to have those processes right. And that's about carrying out right to work checks before the person starts work, and also on a repeat basis for anyone who's permission to be in the UK is for a fixed period of time, and being able to show that you've got a good diary system to flag up when those repeat checks need to be carried out. And often people think they have their right to work processes right, but if spot checks, etc. are carried out, sometimes employers can discover gaps in terms of the record keeping for that. The second area that UKVI look at is whether you have adequate systems to maintain up-to-date contact details for migrant workers. The compliance guidance, which is available online, sets out what information must be kept on file for each migrant worker, and you should have a system in place to make sure that the migrant worker knows to tell you if that information changes, and also probably a kind of annual checking system in place to make sure that the information you've got on file is up to date. The next area that UKVI will look at if they come out to do compliance check is to make sure that you've got adequate record keeping about your sponsored workers. And we'll talk a little bit more later about exactly what records need to be kept on file. The next area is migrant tracking and reporting, and in some of what I'm going to cover and Erin's going to cover is going to focus on that area. So certain changes that impact a migrant worker or a sponsored worker do need to be reported through the sponsor management system, which is the online system used to sort of deal with the license. And we'll flag what sorts of things do need to be reported, and each of those do have timescales attached to when those things need to be reported, and often that's an area that employers get wrong. And then finally, general sponsor duties. This is about acting in good faith in your dealings with UKVI, giving them access to your premises if they come to do a compliance visit, or providing them with information, etc., and acting as a sort of lawful employer. So those are broadly the areas that they look at. So the first of those areas then that we're going to touch on is reporting changes of circumstances that impact migrant workers. So that's looking at changes to the individual rather than the organisation, which we'll come on to deal with separately. And on the slide are a number of things that do need to get reported. I would say it's worth familiarising yourself with the detailed policy guidance that's available online about all of the reporting issues that need to be reported through the sponsor management system. This is just a summary, and also UKVI do update that policy guidance from time to time, so sometimes they might add in additional things that need to be reported. So reviewing that regularly and keeping on top of what these reporting circumstances are is important. So the sorts of things that do need to be reported are, for example, if the individual sponsored worker doesn't show up for their first day of work, if they've been absent without permission for a certain period of time, if they resign, or if their sponsorship ceases. And their sponsorship might cease not just if the employment ends, but for example, if they were to switch onto a different visa, it may be that their sponsorship by you ceases. So termination of employment and the circumstances around that do need to be reported. Other significant changes, for example, to somebody's job title would have to be reported through the sponsor management system, and actually significant changes to somebody's job title might involve an actual change of employment application as well as just a reporting issue. Significant changes to salary, which are not normal, just incremental increases to salary, or other changes to the remuneration arrangements, changes to place of work, etc. So you can see from the examples on here that lots and lots of sort of usual changes in somebody's sort of employment life cycle do need to be reported, and sometimes those are the things that employers don't always report on time. Absences due to maternity, paternity, adoption, or other sort of family leave or sick leave, etc., of a month or more need to be reported. TUPE transfers required to be reported, and in some cases, if somebody's actual employing entity was changing as a result of that, there may be a requirement to put in place a new license, etc. So that may be not a simple case of just reporting that change, but TUPE transfers, I would say check the guidance, because it does set out in detail what it is you need to report there. And then a suspected breach of somebody's immigration conditions of their visa also required to be reported. And most of these changes relating to the individual require to be reported within 10 working days of the event happening. If you do discover that you haven't reported something that should have been reported within that 10-day time frame, it is a good idea to still report it late, and sometimes it is a later point in time that people discover those changes. If we just move on to the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Erin at this point.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. So I'm just going to quickly run through how you actually physically report these types of changes in relation to those that you sponsor. The first step is to log on to the sponsor management system, or the SMS as we sometimes call it. And when you log on, you'll see a screen not unlike the one on the screenshot there. And for anything you're reporting in relation to your workers, you click on the workers section. And down at the bottom there, you can see there's a sponsorship duties option, and that's where you'll click into to then further report. On the next slide, I have the kind of next stage. So once you go into that sponsorship duties option, you will see there's a report migrant activity and a manage live COS option. When you use each will be dependent on where you kind of are in the sponsorship process. So if you're already sponsoring someone, they're already got their visa and they're working for you, anything you report in relation to them will be under the report migrant activity section. If you've assigned a certificate of sponsorship to someone, but they haven't quite yet made their visa application, or they haven't been granted their visa yet, you will click on Manage Live COS. I would say the things that you will report in relation to those who aren't actually working for you yet and you've just assigned a COS to will be limited. So it will be things like delays to start date, or if they're not going to come and work for you as intended any longer. But it is important to know there's two options and when you use each. On the next slide, I then have a kind of further view. So if you click into report migrant activity, you will see certificate sponsorship number for the individual once you input that, and there will be options in the drop down menu of the types of things that you will report. The option that you select will depend on what you're specifically reporting, but I guess the options are to sponsor continuing to sponsor migrant worker, and that's really if you want to report things like a delay to the start date, or if the individual's absent without reason for 10 working days or more. The option sponsor has stopped sponsoring migrant worker is obviously if you're no longer sponsoring them, if they've resigned, you've terminated their employment, or you've otherwise ceased a sponsorship. And basically for anything else that you're reporting, you'll click change in migrant worker circumstances. You'll select the option, and then there will be a kind of box that you can free type into, and you will submit those changes electronically, and they'll kind of sit on that individual certificate sponsorship file. On the next slide then, we also have touched on changes that you must report in relation to your organisation as a sponsor. So as Elaine said, there are things that you have to report in relation to the individuals that you sponsor, but there's also an obligation to report changes to the organisation as well. These are quite commonly missed, so it is similarly to the migrant reporting, important to pull out the guidance and familiarise yourself with it. It does have a kind of comprehensive list of everything that needs to be sponsored, but some examples are on the slide there. So if, for example, your organisation changes its address, you've got to report that to the Home Office. Equally, if it changes its kind of legal trading name, that's also reportable. Also, if there's any change of control or ownership, so if the shares are sold in the sponsor and there's a kind of new owner there, that's very commonly missed, and it is a reportable event. And in some cases, it can mean that the sponsor needs to get a new sponsor licence. So it's really important to make sure that that is on someone's radar, and if it ever happens, that is reported. Also, any changes to key personnel, so if your authorising officer or your level 1 users leave the business and move on, make sure you've got a process in place to capture that and to make sure that those types of things are reported and updated. It's a serious breach to not have a level 1 user or authorising officer in a position, so do make sure you've got a process in place to capture that and replace those individuals if they ever leave the organisation. Also, if there's any changes to your company structure, so if they open up other UK subsidiaries or offices, and it's important for those entities or places to be able to sponsor migrant workers, make sure that they are kept up to date and updated on the sponsor management system. Equally, if there's any takeovers, mergers, sales or insolvency events, make sure that they are also reported in line with the guidance. And also, if you have any representatives on your licence, so solicitors or immigration advisors, make sure you keep that up to date. And if you change your representatives, make sure you change them on the licence as well. For organisational changes, you do have a bit longer to report, so you do have 20 working days of the change occurring to get that uploaded onto the sponsor management system. But do make sure that you're kind of reporting it within that time frame where possible, but it's always better to report late than to not report at all. So on the next slide then, I have a screenshot just to show you how you would report certain things in relation to the sponsor. The kind of process that you'll follow will be dependent on what it is specifically that you're reporting. You'll see on the screen there that you will click for anything in relation to the organisation. You'll go to Licence Summary, Applications and Services. Within there, you'll have the section highlighted that says Manage Level 1 and 2 users, and I'll talk about that specifically in a minute. But for basically anything else, you'll click on Request Changes to Licence Details, and I'll talk about that in a second. So on the next slide, I do have the kind of screenshot of the level 1 user screen. So if you go into Manage Level 1 and 2 users, it will give you a list of everyone that has been and currently is a level 1 user. It's a good screen to familiarise yourself with. It's good to keep on top of it, deactivate those who've left the organisation or are no longer involved in the kind of sponsorship process. If you need to add anyone on, you'll click on that Request Level 1 user box that's highlighted there, and you will insert some personal information on the individual you want to appoint, like their name, date of birth, place of work, nationality, etc. It can take up to 18 weeks to process those requests, so it isn't a very quick process, but you can pay £200 and use the priority service to get a response in 5 working days. It is important to be aware of the timeframes, and that's why it's doubly important to make sure you're kind of on top of your level 1 users and that you've always got someone in the organisation that can access the sponsor management system. On the next slide, if you click into the changes to licence details section that I talked about a few slides ago, it will then give you lots of different options to report depending on what it is you're going to report specifically. You'll see at the top there's a specific section to update your authorising officer's details. So if your authorising officer leaves, that's where you'll go. Same with key contact, you'll see the key contact section there. If you're reporting anything else in relation to your organisation, you'll either go to Amend Organisation Details or the section highlighted that says Request any other change to your licence details. I'll talk about each of them just very quickly. So on the next slide, if you go into amend organisation details, it will show you a section that looks like this. You will use this if you're going to report something quite significant. So if your office or address has changed, you report that here. Also, if you're involved in an acquisition or any kind of change to your name or anything like that, this is the section that you will report it in. You will select the option from the drop down, and then you will fill out the kind of requested information on that specific form. On the next slide, I have the kind of same screen, but on the request any other changes section that we talked about a few slides ago. And this is a slightly broader drop-down menu because it kind of covers just about everything else that you're going to report. So if you've got a new office or site that you want to add onto the license, or if you want to take one away, this is where you'll do it. If you want to add or remove or appoint a representative, this is where you will do that as well. Also, anything in relation to UK subsidiaries, if you've opened up a new kind of subsidiary in the UK that you want to add onto your license, this is where you'll do it. And you'll then fill out the kind of free text box below once you've selected the appropriate option. In terms of change of circumstance in relation to your organisation, then the process is broadly, as I said, go online, report it on SMS and submit that request electronically. In some cases, you'll also have to send what we call a submission sheet, and that's a digital PDF document that will be generated when you submit that request. The authorising officer has to sign that, and then it has to be emailed to the appropriate email address on the submission sheet. There may also be supporting documents required, but the submission sheet will direct you to what types of things are necessary. So for example, if you're adding a new location, you might have to send a lease to show that that address is occupied by the sponsor. Most of these requests take 18 weeks to process. In a lot of cases, that isn't critical if you're just reporting a change of circumstance, but in some cases you might need to prioritise this and try and get a response quicker. So maybe if your authorising officer or your level 1 users have changed. But do check if the priority service is appropriate. It doesn't work for everything, so do double check that. And if anything else is needed once you've submitted your submission sheet and your supporting documents, UKVI will let you know and let you know the kind of next steps. So that's a kind of overview of reporting, and I'll now pass over to Elaine, who will talk a bit about record keeping.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, just before we sort of get to the end, a word on record keeping. So that was one of the areas that we talked about at the outset that UKVI do look at if they come out to do a compliance check. And the most important document to look at here is a document called Appendix D, record keeping. And if you Google that and search, it is available online, and it's updated from time to time, and it tells you exactly what information you must keep on file for any of your sponsored workers. And it is always worth checking that document in case it's got additional things that you need to retain. But broadly, just to give you a bit of an idea of the sorts of things that they expect you to keep on file, it includes evidence of somebody's passport or immigration status, evidence of their right to work, and it may include a requirement for disclosure checks if that person needs to have criminal record checks carried out, copy of their NI number, evidence of their qualifications, etc. Evidence relating to their recruitment, and even although the resident labour market test doesn't apply anymore, there is still a requirement to keep certain information relating to how you recruited the person that you want to employ, and that should be retained on file. Also things like absence records, qualifications, accreditations and registrations, and there is additional information to retain for under 18. But yeah, it's worth just looking in at that document from time to time and making sure you've got everything on file. It doesn't all need to be on paper in a single file, but you should be able to access that sort of information readily if you were to have a compliance visit. If we just move on to the next bit. Yeah, so if UKVI do come in to do a compliance visit, they can spot check files. So they might ask to see these sorts of records, or for you to show them where that information is retained and what systems you've got in place. They might want to check that the person that you've got employed is actually earning the salary that you've indicated on the certificate of sponsorship, and that they're doing the job description that you kind of outlined to them when you applied for the certificate of sponsorship. So having an internal sort of annual audit process is a really good idea to do your own checks to make sure all of this information is on file and is up to date. So that means you're ready at any point in time. If you do have a compliance visit, you know that your files are in good shape. In terms of what UKVI look at on a compliance visit, they may want to verify some of the information provided at the application stage. They may want to look at your right to work check processes, might want to carry out spot checks on certain right to work files for some of your migrant workers. They may want to look at things like job descriptions and whether people are doing the jobs that you've indicated. They may want to carry out interviews with migrant workers if they want to check that they are again doing the job they're supposed to be doing at the salary they're supposed to be paid. They may ask for copies of your policies and procedures. And one of the other obligations, I guess, which sometimes people aren't aware of, is if you've got people working on third-party sort of sites or on third-party contracts, there is an obligation on the sponsor to notify that other organisation that they could also have unplanned visits, so they may look at that sort of issue. And the important thing to bear in mind is that visits can be announced or unannounced. Prior to COVID, the majority of visits were unannounced. There was a period where there were fewer compliance visits carried out. But those visits resumed again in April of last year. So it's possible you might not get notice of a visit. Other things, I think I've mentioned some of these already, that they may look at on a compliance visit is your processes in relation to holidays or monitoring attendance, checking that you've got that contact information on file that we talked about at the beginning. And then in your recruitment processes, if you do, for example, use intermediaries, they might want to know about that sort of thing. And then just before we start the questions and answers, which we've got a couple of minutes for, it is just worth bearing in mind that compliance visits do quite often result in compliance action. So based on some of the statistics that UKVI produce, around 70% of compliance visits result in some sort of UKVI action. So it's not just a sort of theoretical risk, it is a real one. And in 2020, just to give you an idea, there were 323 licenses suspended and a further 291 which were revoked. So they do take action where they see compliance visits. So just to kind of reinforce that message that it is important to get right. So I think we'll just move on quickly to the questions and answers session. And if you want to drop off in a couple of minutes, feel free to, or if you're happy to stay for a minute or two, we might just run over a minute or two.
Okay, yes, we have had some questions. And so firstly, someone's asked, what happens if we do not report a change of circumstance in time?
Well, the best thing to do is to still report it if you discover that you've missed a deadline, to go on and report it in any case. In some cases, if it's a fairly minor issue, UKVI may do nothing, even if you've missed a deadline, for example, for updating somebody's job title, etc. In other cases, if you had a whole series of those missed deadlines and things, it might lead to a compliance visit being undertaken and could potentially result in some kind of recommendations for improvements, etc. But it really depends on the nature of the breach and also frequency. But I would say if you do spot something like that, it's a bit of a warning shot, and it's worth then looking at your processes to make sure that in the future you are reporting on time.
Another question we've had is, are we obliged to allow UKVI entry to our premises?
Yes, that's one of the, I guess, the obligations that you kind of sign up to when you apply for a sponsor license. So they do have the right to carry out these compliance visits, and you are agreeing to give them access to your premises and to cooperate with them and provide them with information, etc. So yes, the answer to that one is yes.
Okay, another one we've had is, will a change in sponsor ownership have any impact on our licence?
So do you want to take
Sure.
this one? I guess that was part of the session you covered.
Yeah, sure. So as I touched on, a change in ownership in a sponsor can result in some cases in a new licence being required, depending on where that change of ownership occurs in the kind of ownership hierarchy. That's why it's really important to make sure that you report any changes to sponsorship or sponsor ownership as quickly as possible, because if you do need to get a new licence, you need to make sure that you make that licence application in line with the kind of timeframe set out by UKVI, and that you transfer any sponsored workers you've got from your older licence to your new one. And it is quite commonly missed because from a kind of employment perspective, I guess the employee and employer relationship doesn't usually change where there's a kind of change of ownership. So on the ground, it might not feel like anything's changing, but it is important from a UKVI perspective, so it should be kind of on someone's radar if that ever occurs.
Okay, I think we might just wrap up there. If anyone's got any other questions later, please feel free to email them in or contact us. There is a feedback forum, I think, that should pop up when you log off, and we'd be very grateful for any feedbacks. That helps us for future sessions. And also just to say the other 2 Back to Basics sessions that we did earlier on are available on Brodie's website if you're interested in looking at those 2. So thanks very much for your time.